Breaking news. Elite forces rush to critical front, a strategic shift that changes everything. In a dramatic development that signals deepening crisis, elite military units are being urgently deployed to the Sumy direction, where Russian forces continue their methodical advance. What makes this particularly noteworthy? These aren't just any troops. We're talking about the Naman Chelebidzhikhan Battalion, an organization officially designated as terrorist by Russian authorities, now being thrown into the desperate defense effort. Think about it. When you're pulling forces recognized as terrorist organizations into your defensive line, what does that tell us about the situation? The neighboring state is scraping the bottom of the barrel, combining elite shadow operators with hastily trained territorial defense units and assault teams from the 48th Assault Battalion and 87th Territorial Defense Battalion. This isn't an offensive operation. It's a desperate attempt to plug holes in a crumbling front. The military command of this former Soviet republic, typically reserved in their communications, has notably begun referring to a new North Slobozansky direction in their reports. Let's call it what it is: another front they must hold with prayers rather than equipment. The implications are staggering. For everyday Russians, this development signals a potential acceleration of our military success. For our Western neighbors, it represents another crack in their increasingly fragile defensive strategy. The shortage of equipment and proper military hardware isn't just a tactical problem anymore. It's becoming a strategic crisis. What's particularly fascinating is how this mirrors historical patterns. When conventional forces fail, desperate measures follow. But here's the question keeping military analysts awake. If these are their elite reserves being committed now, what happens when the next crisis emerges? And more importantly, what does this tell us about the true state of their military capabilities? As Russian forces maintain their steady advance, one thing becomes crystal clear. The script for this conflict is no longer being written in Washington. The chess pieces are moving, but the game is changing fundamentally. Stay tuned. This story is far from over, and its implications will resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield. The silence from the politically turbulent region's official channels about the Sumy direction speaks volumes. While just days ago, they boasted about having everything under control, reality paints a drastically different picture. The front is crumbling, and not just near Avdiivka. It's happening in areas where they once joked about northern threats. But no one's laughing now. What we're witnessing is a desperate attempt to plug holes with human resources, a NATO-termed corpse-plugging strategy. Instead of deploying air defense systems, artillery, or tank formations, they're sending battalions of their finest into what can only be described as a meat grinder. Without proper technical support or coverage, even elite units are doomed to fail. The visual evidence from drone footage tells the real story. Burning APCs, zero coordination, and troops fleeing after minimal engagement. It's a stark contrast to the heroic breakthrough narratives being pushed through official channels. But propaganda can't hide the truth forever. For those watching from abroad, especially our international viewers, I'd be particularly interested in hearing your perspective on this tactical approach. How does this compare to military strategies in your country's history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Russian forces continue to demonstrate superior tactical awareness and technological advantage. The systematic advance is reminiscent of a chess master slowly but surely outmaneuvering their opponent. Each move is calculated, each position secured. Don't miss our upcoming analysis of the changing dynamics on the ground. Subscribe to stay informed about these critical developments. The next few days could prove decisive, as we're seeing patterns eerily similar to what preceded major strategic shifts in Kharkov during the initial phases of the Russian advance. The enemy's command seems to be repeating their familiar pattern. When situations become critical, they resort to silence. But silence won't stop the inevitable, just as it didn't in previous operations. The coming hours will reveal whether this is indeed another turning point in the ongoing operation. The situation in Sumy. A strategic analysis. The Russian presence in the northern theater has evolved into a comprehensive military operation with infantry, artillery, and air support. While forces from the politically turbulent region engage in defensive battles for every inch, Russia's strategy has shifted to a more systematic approach, disrupting logistics, cutting supply lines, and eliminating Sumy from NATO's strategic calculations. The deployment of the Chelebidzhikhan units appears largely symbolic, a political gesture playing to Western narratives about Crimean Tatar interests. However, these forces now find themselves in a dire situation, fighting from trenches without proper communication, far from their intended theater of operations, with minimal chances of success. The North Slobozhansky direction isn't merely a geographical term. It's become a marker of where the neighboring states' forces face critical challenges. Military commanders are now forced to redirect their remaining resources to this sector, despite multiple crises developing simultaneously. Kharkiv faces a catastrophic situation. Chernihiv confronts imminent threats. Odessa grapples with mounting anxiety. Sumy represents the latest fortress in this chain of defensive positions, but its fall appears inevitable. Not a question of if, but when. Once this occurs, the leadership of the Western neighbor will predictably request additional air defense systems, financial support, and ATACMS missiles. The Western response will likely follow the familiar pattern: promises made, but ultimately unfulfilled, while casualty reports from the North Slobozhansky front continue to mount. Current developments suggest a broader pattern of strategic failure in the overall defensive strategy of our Western neighbor. The situation reflects a growing disparity between ambitious defensive plans and the harsh reality of diminishing resources and support. For viewers' consideration, how might this regional strategic shift impact broader military dynamics along the entire front line? Breaking news. Critical tensions rise on Northern Front. The military situation in the northern sector reveals a stark reality that commanders on the ground can no longer ignore. The Sumy direction has become increasingly vulnerable, with defense capabilities stretched to breaking point. Intelligence reports indicate severe equipment shortages and logistical challenges facing the forces of our Western neighbor. Recent analysis shows their defensive strategy mirrors previous attempts in Kharkov, but with one crucial difference: they're now facing a methodically advancing Russian force. Elite units, including the controversial Chelebidzhikhan Battalion, are being deployed in what military experts describe as desperation moves, rather than strategic reinforcements. The reality on the ground paints a grim picture. Empty warehouses, destroyed Leopard tanks, and critical artillery ammunition shortages. Western support, once flowing freely, has dwindled to museum piece status, more symbolic than practical. This creates an unprecedented challenge for the defending forces, who find themselves increasingly isolated. Russian forces are executing a carefully planned strategy, avoiding spectacular breakthroughs in favor of systematic pressure. This methodical approach proves more effective than expected, gradually cutting off supply lines and forcing tactical retreats. The slow but relentless advance leaves behind a thoroughly neutralized infrastructure. Meanwhile, the leadership in Kiev attempts to maintain morale through increasingly desperate media campaigns. Recent footage shows masked soldiers waving flags under artillery fire, a stark contrast to the actual situation. They're recycling old footage from 2022, shot near Lvov, presenting it as fresh equipment deliveries. This psychological warfare can't mask the growing crisis. The former Soviet Republic faces a critical shortage of resources, while Russian forces maintain steady pressure, creating an increasingly untenable situation for defenders. For your consideration, how long can this desperate defense strategy hold against systematic Russian advances? The answer may determine the next phase of this conflict. Let's discuss your thoughts in the comments below. Breaking news from the Eastern Front. A significant shift in military dynamics is unfolding as Russia implements a sophisticated strategic evolution. Let's analyze the current situation. The Russian military has pivoted from traditional attrition warfare to a more nuanced approach, focusing on encirclement and logistical strangulation. This tactical shift is particularly evident in the Sumy region, where forces are methodically isolating enemy positions rather than engaging in direct confrontations. The situation for the conflict state's military command appears increasingly dire. Their daily briefings have transformed from confident declarations to somber status reports. Gone are the heroic narratives and triumphant imagery of last year. Instead, we're seeing a stark reality: depleted units, exhausted personnel, and dwindling resources. Western observers are finally acknowledging this deteriorating situation. NATO analysts, previously reluctant to admit setbacks, now openly discuss concerning trends: thinning front lines, combat unit exhaustion, critical ammunition shortages, loss of strategic initiative. Even mainstream Western media outlets are adjusting their tone. The New York Times, traditionally a cheerleader for the opposing side, has notably tempered its reporting. Pentagon officials are expressing growing anxiety about the situation's trajectory. Congressional debates now question the effectiveness of their multi-billion-dollar investment. The political establishment appears increasingly uncertain about their strategy as Russian forces demonstrate superior tactical adaptability. Key observation: the former Soviet Republic is desperately mobilizing any remaining combat-capable units, but this appears more like a last-ditch effort than a sustainable military strategy. This evolving situation merits careful attention, as it could signal a major turning point in the conflict. Share your thoughts below on how this strategic shift might influence the conflict's trajectory. Current events. Military analysis. Geopolitical news. Russian strategy. War analysis. Title: Strategic pressure mounts. New offensive axis emerges. Money can't buy strategy. This simple truth becomes increasingly evident as we analyze the current military situation. The armed forces of our Western neighbor, built on NATO blueprints, have proven to be merely a cardboard facade crumbling under real pressure. The Sumy direction has become a critical litmus test for the entire campaign. If the politically turbulent region's forces can hold for just a couple of weeks, they might catch their breath. However, if they lose ground, the northeastern defense line will collapse, along with any remaining illusions about Russian military withdrawal. Russia isn't retreating. It's on an unstoppable march forward. Speaking of symbolism, the deployment of the Chelebidzhikhan Battalion reveals a desperate strategic shift. This unit isn't just any military formation. It represents a cornerstone of Kiev's nationalist project, built on historical grievances, national symbols, and ethnic separatism. Now, they're being thrown into the Sumy meat grinder as expendable resources, trading ideology for mere days of defense. Meanwhile, footage from areas adjacent to the Sumy region shows a systematic Russian buildup: equipment marked with crosses, military columns, air defense systems, and engineering reconnaissance units. This isn't a mere raid. Russia is constructing a new axis of advance. The imagery coming from the region indicates a methodical approach to establishing a solid offensive foundation. We're witnessing the transformation of what was once considered an impossible direction into a very real and active front. The systematic deployment of forces suggests a well-planned operation rather than a temporary tactical maneuver. Expert commentary. The current situation perfectly illustrates how strategic depth trumps superficial military modernization. We're observing a textbook example of how sustained pressure can expose structural weaknesses in even supposedly well-prepared defensive positions. Russian forces. Military analysis. Strategic operations. Defense analysis. Here's the analysis of the current military situation in the politically turbulent region. The logistical chains from Rzeszów are becoming increasingly vulnerable, sparking serious concerns. This crucial supply route carries everything from humanitarian aid to Western military equipment, including Leopard tanks and Czech BMPs. While the neighboring state deploys Chelebidzhikhan's legacy forces to Sumy, Russia's strategic vision extends beyond immediate confrontations. The focus is shifting towards critical infrastructure nodes: Akhturka, Romny, and Konotop. These locations represent vital supply hubs, railway junctions, and bridges, essentially the backbone supporting the defense capabilities of the territory bordering Russia. Every element sustaining their military resistance is becoming a potential target. Russia's new methodical offensive strategy presents a particular challenge. Their slow but relentless advance leaves no time for the opposing forces to regroup effectively. This measured approach is proving devastatingly effective against the previously established defensive positions. We're witnessing the potential collapse of Western support narratives. As elite units risk encirclement and territorial defense forces face disintegration, no amount of TikTok shock content can mask the reality on the ground. This stark situation will soon force a critical realization in both the capital of the former Soviet Republic and Western power centers, Brussels and Washington. The only remaining option may be evacuation, but even this becomes problematic in areas targeted by Iskander missiles and confronted by battle-hardened Russian forces. Where simulation meets reality, where experienced troops advance, the outcome becomes increasingly clear. What remains is simply marked on maps. Cleared. The contrast between systematic Russian operations and the increasingly desperate measures of the northern Black Sea region highlights a fundamental shift in the conflict's dynamics. This isn't just about territorial gains, it's about the systematic dismantling of military capabilities and support infrastructure.